Thank you. I'd first actually like to start out with some audience participation. So we're gonna make a little list of words that you think of when you hear the word Iran. So the first thing that comes to your head, we're gonna add it to the board here. Shout it out, anybody. Hostage.
Nuclear.
War. Ayatollah Khomeini.
Anything else? Middle East.
Oil.
Mm-hmm.
Religion.
Any last minute comments? Okay, so I guess if you take a look at all these words on the board, a lot of them have a similar theme, and I guess you wouldn't really say that a lot of these have a positive connotation. However, if you do look back in U.S. history and Iranian history, these words probably wouldn't have come up, or many of them would not have come up in 1968 or 1972 when Richard Nixon was in office. So the first thing we'll talk about is U.S. and Iranian history. Before World War II, there's just a small amount of trade between Iran and the U.S. During the Second World War, Iran was a transportation corridor to get supplies into the Soviet Union. And this is just a map showing where the Soviets invaded and where the British invaded Iran during the war. Iran was neutral, so they had to invade so that they could move their stuff through it. Also at this time, Reza Shah, who was the ruler of the country, abdicated the throne and left it to his young son. So, and then until 1955, Iran did not receive many arms from the United States. It was in 1955 that Iran joined the Baghdad Pact, which brings us to Mohammad Reza Shah. This is, of course, the young man who took over the throne when his father abdicated. Twice in his life, he was threatened by an assassin's gun. Once, I read a very dramatic retelling of it, where he was shot at and all of his security people bailed out of the way and he was left facing the assassin, and the assassin pulled the trigger and it jammed. So his life was spared, and then obviously his security people who abandoned him were punished after that, I'm sure. Even the Shah's own family doubted his abilities when he began. He was well educated and a very smart young man, but he was very young, and even his mother, it was said, had plotted against him. He began consolidating his rule in two ways. First, he started a series of reforms called the White Revolution, and these were land reform, women's rights, healthcare, education, different things like that. Some people call it a success, and others say that it was just a bunch of different cures for a bunch of different ills. It wasn't really a comprehensive thing, so it didn't do a lot of good. And then another way that he consolidated his rule was the divide and conquer method, actually. With the closest people around him, the political and social elite, he actually made them all rivals to each other. So he was the only person that they could trust, and he turned them against each other. And in this way, he became very powerful. At the time of the situation, we have, this is actually after his power. You can see he's very, very wealthy. In this time, during Nixon's first term, 1968 to 1972, the regional situation was a little volatile. The British had announced in 1968 that they were withdrawing from the Persian Gulf, which is right here, which the Shah, finding this out, decided that he had some radical Arab neighbors that he was scared of, and that he also had a long-standing friendship with the U.S., and because of this, he decided that he wanted to become the protector of the region. So in order to do this, he threatened to take over two tiny little islands in the Straits of Hormuz, which are right there. And those are the tombs in Abu Musa. And actually, today, 40% of the world's oil goes through that strait. So it's a very, very important waterway for world shipping. The U.S., in relating to the Shah, was really concerned about this because they knew that his neighbors would not be so much of a fan of him controlling the Persian Gulf. So they tried to talk him out of it. And they were also worried, more so the Shah was worried, about his other neighbors all around him. So the first one that we'll talk about is Iraq. Iraq was getting weapons from the Soviet Union. They had communist leanings. In addition, Syria was also receiving help from the Soviet Union. Egypt, if you remember 1956 and the Suez Crisis and Nasser and all those weapons. There was, I think it was 1970 or 71, there was the Indo-Pakistani War where the Soviets sided with India. Again, this all made the Shah really nervous. He said that there were communist leanings in Oman here. So if you kind of look at it, it basically makes a big circle around Iran, other than Turkey. Almost all of his borders are with states that have some type of communist leanings. Even Saudi Arabia, who was considered a U.S. ally at the time, the Shah was concerned about because he thought that there might not be a successor to King Faisal, and what if the Soviets got in there and, stirred some things up. So I guess you could maybe say that he was pretty paranoid about the region at the time. And he had really good contacts within the embassy and the administration in the U.S. So he was constantly talking about how he was worried about different things. And often the embassy took his side on these situations. In fact, MacArthur, who was the ambassador, wrote in one paper that the U.S. did not have the right to express which weapons that Iran should get if the U.S. was not willing to give an ironclad guarantee of security, and which, of course, the U.S. was not willing to do. However, there were some at the time who doubted the situation that the Shah was talking about. Joseph Sisko, who was the Assistant Secretary of State for Near Eastern and South Asian Affairs, said that Iraq and Syria, although they were getting Soviet help, became uncooperative and demonstrated independent attitudes when the Soviets pushed them too far. So, in this situation, the U.S. had 4 different solutions. The first was to assume the United Kingdom's role as protector of the Persian Gulf. So the U.S. would come in and do it themselves. The second was to back either Iran or Saudi Arabia as the key to stability in the region. The third was to pressure Saudi and Iran to cooperate and work together for regional security. And then the third was to actively promote a regional security pact. The first and last were thrown out as impossible. So the National Security Council decided that they should try to combine the middle two, so that they would support Iran as the stability country in the region, and then have Iran and Saudi Arabia work together at the same time. Which brings us to the Nixon Doctrine. This is the third line of the Nixon Doctrine, which says, "Third, in cases involving other types of aggression, we shall furnish military and economic assistance when requested in accordance with our treaty commitments. But we shall look to the nation directly threatened to assume the primary responsibility of providing the manpower for its defense." So in Iran's case, this meant we'll give you the money and the weapons, and you need to provide the people to work them and to secure your country and the region as a whole. So basically, Iran was acting as a proxy in the region. The Shah knew that the U.S. needed help in the region, so he used this fact to exploit weapons. He knew that the U.S. couldn't really get friendly with many other countries over there, so he used his little in to get what he wanted. And actually, the Shah himself was a skilled pilot, so some of the things that he requested were often had to do with very technologically advanced aircraft. And there are lots of arguments about weapons, and they went on and on from 1968 until 1972. And this is kind of a starting list of them. We have two columns, for weapons and against weapons. So in the embassy said that if the Shah can't get weapons from the US, he'll go elsewhere. There are other sources. And he also said that even if the Shah went to Great Britain and France, which are also free world countries, that this would be a loss for the US. It would be a victory for the Soviet Union. And then the embassy, MacArthur, also cited that increasing oil revenues would help pay for the weapons. We'll discuss later that paying for the weapons was a major concern at the time. And then another reason to give Iran weapons would be that the region in general was unresponsive to US power. Nobody else was really willing to cooperate with the US. So the arguments against getting weapons. These arguments take up stacks and stacks of paper just in those 4 years. The State Department and the Department of Defense were concerned because these very expensive weapons would take a very large portion of Iran's national budget. And a country like Iran was not very developed at the time, so a lot of this money could be spent on other more useful things like education or healthcare or economic stimulus or reform of some type. And they were afraid that if Iran spent all of its money on weapons, or a huge portion of its money, that the people would become upset and you'd have an uprising. The Military Assistance Advisory Group, abbreviated MAG, noted that the Shah liked exotic equipment, often that they could not afford to purchase. General Twitchell, who was stationed in Iran, somebody actually on the ground, also noted that it would be absurd to give Iran these weapons because it could get there and there's not even a guarantee that there are trained men to operate it. So it might get there and just sit on the ground for months, maybe even years, until someone can get trained to use it. The State Department noted that the threat to Iran was subversive, not military. So the Shah was going around being worried that Iraq would invade or all these other countries were going to invade militarily, but in reality the State Department thought that it was a subversive threat, something that can't really be countered by weapons. And then also in that same vein, more military equipment might be seen by Iran's neighbors as a threat, potentially triggering an arms race. The US will supply Iran with weapons, Soviet Union will supply Iraq, and they will keep building up. As you can see, the for weapons column ends because there really are no more for weapons arguments. But also against more weapons would be the State Department did a study of the forces of Iraq and Iran and decided that Iran had a superior military force in numbers, in morale, in motivation, in training, and those other things. The Department of Defense got really upset when Nixon decided to give the Shah whatever he wanted. So they said that you can't have the airplanes, they need to be operationally tested. And it would be a mistake to give them to you right now because we haven't even tested them. And it would also be a mistake to promise them to you because 3 years from now when they're ready to come out of the production lines, situations might have changed and it would be counterproductive to give them to Iran. So that was their way of trying to get around it. The Department of Defense also had difficulty finding people to take unaccompanied tours in Iran to work on the ground training Iranians to use this new equipment. They thought about doing accompanied tours, but this could raise the military presence. They said up to 10,000 people, and their goal was really to keep the military presence low in the country in order for the safety of the people there and for the reputation of the United States in general. Also, before we go on to the blank check, the Department of Defense gave Iran a certain number of slots for training pilots in the US, and it had half of all the slots were allotted to Iran from the whole world, and there were other countries that were waiting in line, but the Shah still wanted more. And at the Air Force Training Academy, for the beginning pilots, Iran was unable to fill its allotted 10 spots because its candidates lacked English adequacy. So it wasn't even able to fill the spots that it had. So in 1972, Nixon and Kissinger made a visit to Iran, and after this visit, a presidential directive was issued, and this is what it said. With regard to the question of U.S. arms sales in Iran, the President's policy is to encourage purchases of U.S. equipment. Decisions as to the desirability of equipment acquisitions should be left in the hands of the Iranian government, and the U.S. should not undertake to discourage on economic grounds. If the government of Iran has decided to buy certain equipment, no other restrictions other than the normal licensing and legal requirements should be placed on U.S. firms which are prepared to supply it. So basically, this is giving the Shah a blank check to buy whatever he wants. This one statement basically erases that 4 years of arguing over how many weapons Iran should get and which ones, and all that other stuff. It overrules everything else. Which leads us to the internal situation in Iran. At this time, there were a few reports going around of what was happening in the country itself. The CIA issued one report about the Communist Party in Iran, saying that it was minimal and the activities were just aimed at surviving. So this was good news for the U.S. Obviously, it's Cold War time. We're concerned about communism. And then the Shah himself talked about the polarization for wealth and the demand for political freedom, and said these are all just parts of the process and they can be effectively countered by some reforms later. So basically, it's not really a big deal that these things are happening. And then the embassy in 1971 reported that the Shah was revered by the people in Iran, and at lower levels of society, it even turned to veneration. So they just loved the Shah, according to this report. On the other hand, we have some other reports that say the picture wasn't quite as rosy as that. A report from the embassy on youth described a life where youth were unsatisfied with the heavily censored newspaper, secret police, restricted movement in and out of the country, and the prohibition of dissenting opinions and expressions. And the youth in this report, it said that they believed that these situations were a direct creation of the Shah. So they blamed all this on him. Many Iranians also believe that the tension between Iran and its neighbors was caused by the Shah purposely so that he could justify spending all this money on these weapons that he wanted. And then, of course, the U.S. was linked to the Shah because we had been at his side for so many decades and been a very good friend to him. Student disturbances, it was reported, were becoming more numerous and severe with serious consequences for the country's long-term stability. And actually, these disturbances made the State Department issue a warning saying that a violence-inclined youth underground has taken root in Iran. And the embassy also reported that during summer vacation, when the students usually go home, the number of disturbances had actually gone up, which was unusual. And they linked this to broadening support in other non-student groups, which is not a good sign. Many Iranians also believed that the CIA was the grandfather of Saavik, which is the secret police of Iran. And like many other secret police around the world, Saavik was not a nice organization. They often brutally repressed demonstrations, student demonstrations. They would go into the campus and arrest people. And they had a habit of hauling in the innocent with the guilty, which obviously did not make them any friends in the Iranian public. And many people thought that the CIA either completely controlled or had a very strong influence on Saavik at this time. So the U.S. was very closely linked to Iran in the eyes of many Iranians. However, many of these reports from people living in Iran were done by lower officials in the embassy, and if they ever did make it to publication, often they were changed, they were taken by a supervisor, and the words were changed, and sometimes they wouldn't even recognize the report that they began in the first place. When they did get through in their original form, they're often either looked at and ignored or just completely ignored in the first place, stuck under the stack and other things like that. Many of these policies of giving Iran whatever it wants, not taking into consideration the internal situation of the country, continued through the rest of the Nixon administration and through the Carter administration until the image that we all know very well, which is the hostage crisis in 1979. So that is the end of my report. Does anybody have any questions? I'll give you time to think. Sure.
Kim, when you were looking at the analysis that the U.S. government was doing of U.S. policy in the Middle East, when they decide to back close relations with the royal government of Iran and the royal government of Saudi Arabia, the American policymakers feel uncomfortable about maintaining relationships with these royal regimes when, during the Cold War, they make such a big deal about promoting democracy around the world.
From what I was reading, it didn't really seem like they had a problem with it. The Shah had been friends, he was actually very good friends with Nixon himself and with one of the Rockefellers, Nelson Rockefeller, I think. So although the principles were there that we should spread democracy in order to get what we want, which is security and stability and no communism, I think that was more important to them than spreading the American ideal of democracy. Yeah?
Questions? Can you go back to the picture before this?
Sure.
Is that a general there on the second from the right?
I'm not sure.
I mean, he's the current leader.
Oh.
If I can respond, I know that this is an issue that keeps on coming up. My understanding is that Ahmadinejad denies being involved in the hostage crisis, though the accusation does keep on cropping up.
Yeah, it does.
And also, what the Saavik, did they disappear when the Shah was removed from power? Are they still in place?
They're gone, aren't they?
Yeah, I mean, Saavik was. I'm sorry, I don't want to.
No, it's fine. I didn't research much past 74,
yeah,
so.
Yeah, I mean, Saavik was the Shah's secret police. So as you can imagine, the revolutionaries of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I'm not sure exactly what happened to Saavik, but that apparatus was completely wiped out. Though the Islamic Republic has its own secret police.
The Revolutionary Guard.
Yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you for listening.